Jacob Morrison had been living alone on his Wyoming homestead for 3 long years. Every morning he'd wake up to complete silence. Every evening he'd eat dinner by himself, staring at empty chairs. The only voices he ever heard were his own and the occasional neighing of his horses. His closest neighbor lived 15 miles away, which meant days would pass without seeing another human face. He was 32 years old now, and the loneliness was eating him alive. Sure, he had his land, his animals, and his small cabin, but what good was any of it when there was no one to share it with? No one to talk to at the end of a long day. No one to laugh with or plan a future alongside. The Wyoming prairie stretched endlessly in every direction around his property. Beautiful, yes, but also isolating in a way that pressed down on his chest some nights. He'd moved out here with big dreams of building something meaningful, of carving out a life in the frontier. But he'd never imagined how crushing the silence could become. One particularly harsh winter evening, Jacob sat by his fireplace with a bottle of whiskey and a piece of paper. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The loneliness felt heavier than usual that night. He was tired of talking to himself, tired of the echo of his own footsteps being the only sound in the cabin. That's when he made the decision. He'd heard about mail-order bride agencies back east. Men on the frontier used them all the time to find wives. It wasn't the most romantic way to meet someone, sure, but what other choice did he have? He couldn't exactly court women when the nearest town was a 2-hour ride away. Jacob pulled out his pen and started writing. He described himself honestly in the letter. He talked about his homestead, his work ethic, his dreams of building a real home and maybe raising a family someday. He mentioned that he didn't drink much, that he could cook decent enough meals, and that he was looking for a genuine partner in life. But there was one thing he didn't mention. One detail he conveniently left out. Jacob stood barely 5 feet 4 inches tall. He'd been short his entire life, and he knew exactly how people reacted to it. He'd been overlooked, dismissed, and outright laughed at more times than he could count. So he kept that information to himself. In his letter, he specifically requested a woman of gentle nature and modest stature. He imagined someone petite, someone who wouldn't tower over him, someone who might actually see him as a man capable of providing and protecting. He sealed the envelope and sent it off to a reputable agency in Boston, then tried not to think about it too much. Winter turned to spring. Spring warmed into summer. Jacob had almost forgotten about the letter entirely when, 3 months later, a telegram arrived at the small post office in town. His hand shook slightly as he read it. A woman named Miss Eleanor Wright had agreed to be his bride. She would be arriving on the afternoon train the following week. Jacob's heart raced with a mixture of excitement and terror. This was really happening. After 3 years of soul-crushing loneliness, someone was actually coming. Someone who'd agreed to share his life, to build something together with him. The week leading up to her arrival was a blur of frantic preparation. Jacob cleaned his cabin more thoroughly than he ever had before. He scrubbed floors that hadn't been properly washed in months. He aired out blankets and washed curtains. He even attempted to fix the broken shutter on the front window, though he wasn't entirely successful. He practiced what he'd say to her, rehearsing his greeting in front of the small mirror above his wash basin. "Welcome to Wyoming, Miss Wright. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult." No, that sounded too formal. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you're here." Too familiar for a first meeting. He must have tried 50 different versions, feeling more foolish each time. Jacob bought new clothes for the occasion, spending money he probably shouldn't have. But first impressions mattered, didn't they? He got a haircut and trimmed his beard. He even bought a small bottle of cologne from the general store, ignoring the knowing smirk from the shop owner who'd clearly heard about the mail-order bride arriving. The night before her arrival, Jacob could barely sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, imagining what she'd be like. In his mind, he pictured a small, delicate woman with a sweet smile, someone who'd be grateful for the home he'd built, someone who'd appreciate his hard work and dedication, someone who might actually be happy with him. He imagined them working together, her maybe tending a garden while he managed the livestock. He pictured quiet evenings together, reading by the fireplace. Maybe eventually there'd be children, laughter filling the cabin that had been silent for so long. Jacob had no idea that everything he was imagining was about to be turned completely upside down. He had no way of knowing that the woman stepping off that train would be nothing like what he'd pictured. and he certainly couldn't have guessed that his carefully worded request for someone of modest stature was about to become the biggest irony of his life. As he finally drifted off to sleep that night, Jacob Morrison was filled with hope. Tomorrow his lonely life would finally change. Tomorrow everything would be different. He just had no idea exactly how different it would actually be. The morning of her arrival, Jacob was up before dawn. He hitched up his wagon, making sure it looked as presentable as possible. He picked wildflowers from the prairie, carefully arranging them into a bouquet. His hands trembled slightly as he tied them with a ribbon. As he rode into town that afternoon, his stomach churned with nervous anticipation. This was it, the moment that would change everything. For better or worse, his life of solitude was about to end. Miss Eleanor Wright was coming, and Jacob Morrison had no idea what he was actually in for. The train whistle cut through the afternoon air like a knife. Jacob stood on the wooden platform, gripping his bouquet of wildflowers so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His heart hammered against his ribs. Any moment now he'd meet the woman who'd agreed to marry him, to share his life out on the prairie. The train hissed and groaned as it came to a complete stop. Steam billowed from beneath the engine, creating a dramatic backdrop for the moment Jacob had been both dreading and anticipating for weeks. Passengers started climbing down from the cars one after another. Jacob watched each person carefully. There was a family with 3 children, the mother looking exhausted from travel. A couple of businessmen in suits stepped off discussing cattle prices. An elderly woman was helped down by the conductor. Several ranch hands jumped down, already heading toward the saloon. But no woman traveling alone. No one who looked like they might be a mail-order bride arriving to meet her future husband. Then the door of the last passenger car opened, and Jacob's entire world tilted on its axis. Eleanor Wright appeared at the top of the steps, and Jacob literally took a step backward. His mouth fell open. Every rehearsed greeting he'd practiced vanished from his mind completely. She was enormous. Not fat, not heavy, just impossibly, incredibly tall and powerfully built. She had to duck slightly to clear the door frame of the train car. When she straightened up on the platform, Jacob estimated she stood at least 6 feet 2 inches, maybe even taller. She towered over every single person at the station. Her shoulders were broad and strong, the kind of build you'd expect on a working man, not a woman. Her arms looked powerful, muscular even through the sleeves of her travel dress. Her hands, Jacob noticed with growing dismay, were huge. They looked like they could snap a branch in half without effort. Eleanor's face wasn't delicate or soft. It was weathered, angular, with a strong jawline and a nose that looked like it might have been broken once. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a severe bun, not a single strand out of place. Everything about her screamed strength and capability, and absolutely nothing like the petite, gentle woman Jacob had been expecting. She carried 2 massive travel trunks, one in each hand as if they weighed nothing at all. Jacob had struggled to lift just one trunk when he'd helped load freight at the station before. She was carrying both like they were empty baskets. Their eyes met across the platform. Jacob saw her expression shift in real time. Her face, which had held a cautious hope when she first stepped off the train, fell into obvious disappointment. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. Her shoulders, already broad, seemed to sag slightly. She'd been expecting someone different too. Someone taller, probably. Someone who looked like he could actually provide and protect. Someone who didn't look like a boy standing next to her. The other passengers had cleared the platform now. The train conductor was calling out final boarding warnings for those heading further west. And still, Jacob and Eleanor stood frozen, staring at each other from opposite ends of the wooden planks. Jacob's carefully arranged wildflowers suddenly felt ridiculous in his hands. What had he been thinking? That a few prairie flowers would make up for the fact that he was exactly the opposite of what any woman would want. That she'd overlooked the fact that she could probably lift him over her head without breaking a sweat? Eleanor took a step forward. Then another. She moved with surprising grace for someone her size, but there was a heaviness to her walk, like someone carrying an invisible burden they'd been shouldering their entire life. Mr. Morrison? Her voice was deeper than Jacob expected, but not unpleasant. Just another thing that was different from what he'd imagined. Miss Wright. His own voice came out smaller than intended. He cleared his throat and tried again. Welcome to Wyoming. I hope your journey wasn't too difficult. It was one of the greetings he'd practiced, but it sounded hollow now. Automatic. Like words you say because you're supposed to say something, not because they mean anything. It was long. Eleanor set down her trunks with a heavy thud that made the platform boards shake. She looked around at the small town, at the dusty street and the handful of buildings that made up the entire downtown. This is it? There was no judgment in her voice, just a flat statement of fact. But Jacob felt defensive anyway. The homestead is about an hour's ride from here. It's more private out there. Peaceful. He held out the flowers awkwardly. I brought these for you. Eleanor looked at the bouquet like she wasn't quite sure what to do with it. After a long moment, she took it, her large hands making the flowers look even smaller. Thank you. Silence stretched between them again. The train whistle blew one final time, and then the engine started pulling away, leaving them alone on the platform. Really, truly alone with their shattered expectations and the dawning reality of what they'd both gotten themselves into. I'll get your trunks loaded, Jacob said, moving toward them. He grabbed the handle of one trunk and pulled. It barely budged. He tried again, putting his back into it, and managed to drag it a few inches. Let me. Eleanor set down the flowers and picked up both trunks again, carrying them to Jacob's wagon without any visible effort. She loaded them into the back as easily as if they were made of paper. Jacob felt his face burn with humiliation. Great start. Really impressive. Show your new bride that you can't even lift her luggage while she handles it without breaking a sweat. He climbed up onto the wagon bench and took the reins. Eleanor stood there for a moment, looking at the space beside him. The bench wasn't really built for someone her size. She finally climbed up and immediately her knees hit the front board. She had to sit at an angle, twisted uncomfortably, because there simply wasn't enough room for her long legs. Jacob clicked his tongue and got the horses moving. They rode in complete silence for the first 20 minutes. The only sounds were the creaking of the wagon wheels, the clip-clop of the horses' hooves, and the whisper of wind across the prairie grass. Jacob tried to think of something to say. Anything. But what do you say to someone when you both know you've made a terrible mistake? When you both realize that the picture you'd painted in your letters was nothing like reality? I worked at a factory in Boston, Eleanor finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was carefully controlled, formal. Loading cargo at the docks mostly. It was work usually reserved for men. Oh. Jacob didn't know what else to say to that. I'm very strong, good with repairs and heavy lifting. I can work hard. She was staring straight ahead, not looking at him. I thought that might be useful on a homestead. I'm sure it will be. The words felt inadequate, but Jacob meant them. He could certainly use help with the heavier work he'd been struggling to manage alone. More silence. The sun was starting to sink lower on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Under different circumstances, it might have been romantic. As it was, it just felt sad. I have a spare room, Jacob said as his cabin came into view in the distance. You can sleep there. I mean, until, well, you'll have privacy. I'll sleep in the barn. Eleanor's voice was flat, final. That's not necessary. The spare room is perfectly. I'll sleep in the barn, she repeated. And this time there was something in her voice that told Jacob not to argue. When they finally reached the homestead, Eleanor climbed down from the wagon before it had fully stopped. She grabbed her trunks and headed straight for the barn without another word, without waiting for Jacob to show her around or explain anything. Jacob sat in the wagon, watching her disappear into the barn, and felt more alone than he had in all 3 years of living by himself. At least when he'd been alone, he'd had hope. Now he had company, and somehow that made the loneliness worse. That night, Jacob lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. Through his window, he could see the lamplight in the barn. Eleanor was out there, probably just as miserable as he was, probably already planning her escape on the next train back to Boston. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. None of this was how it was supposed to be. The first 2 weeks at the homestead were absolute torture. Jacob and Eleanor lived like two strangers forced to share the same space, both too polite and too proud to acknowledge the obvious disaster of their situation. Every morning, Jacob would wake to find Eleanor already up and working. She'd emerge from the barn at dawn, barely acknowledging him with a stiff nod before throwing herself into whatever task she could find. It was like she was trying to work herself to exhaustion, to prove her worth, or maybe just to avoid having to talk to him. Meals were the worst. Jacob would prepare breakfast and leave a plate for Eleanor on the porch. She'd take it without a word. eating alone outside or in the barn. Lunch was the same. Dinner, too. They were living on the same property but might as well have been miles apart. Jacob tried to make conversation a few times. He'd approach her while she was mending a fence or mucking out the horse stalls, attempting small talk about the weather, or asking if she needed help with anything. Eleanor would answer in short, clipped sentences that made it clear she had no interest in chatting. Her responses were polite but cold, just barely on the right side of rude. What hurt most was how she'd flinch whenever he came too close. Not dramatically, but he noticed it every time. A slight tensing of her shoulders, a small step back like she expected him to say something cruel or mock her. It made Jacob feel like some kind of monster, even though he'd never done anything to warrant that reaction. But he couldn't deny the truth. He was disappointed too, wasn't he? Every time he looked at Eleanor and felt that uncomfortable mixture of inadequacy and resentment, he was being just as judgmental as he feared she was being toward him. They were both trapped in a situation neither had wanted, both too stubborn to admit defeat but too uncomfortable to make the best of it. Meanwhile, Eleanor worked like a woman possessed. That barn roof Jacob had been meaning to fix for 6 months, she repaired it in a single morning, climbing up there with supplies and hammering away while he watched from below, feeling useless. The collapsed section of fencing on the north pasture that would have taken him weeks to rebuild, she had it done in 3 days, working from sunup to sundown. The broken water pump that Jacob had been hauling buckets to work around, fixed. The shed door that had been hanging crooked for over a year, rehung and reinforced. The drainage ditch that kept flooding near the vegetable garden, redirected and properly channeled. It was impressive, sure. But it also made Jacob feel smaller than he already was. What was his purpose here? What was he contributing? Eleanor was doing all the physical work he'd struggled with and doing it better and faster than he ever could. She made him feel obsolete on his own property. One afternoon, about 10 days after her arrival, Jacob was in the cabin preparing lunch when he glanced out the window. Eleanor was working on the chicken coop, reinforcing the wire mesh that had gotten damaged over the winter. She moved with practiced efficiency, her strong hands working the wire into place without any visible effort. But then Jacob noticed something that made his chest tighten. Her shoulders were shaking, just slightly but enough that he could tell. He stepped closer to the window and realized with a jolt that she was crying. Not sobbing, not making any sound, just silent tears running down her weathered face as she worked. Eleanor wiped at her eyes roughly with the back of her hand, angry at herself for the display of weakness. Then she went right back to work, attacking the task with even more intensity than before. Jacob turned away from the window, feeling like he'd invaded her privacy by witnessing that moment, but he couldn't shake the image from his mind. She was miserable. Just as miserable as he was, maybe more so. She'd traveled all the way from Boston hoping for a new start, for somewhere she might finally fit in. And instead she'd found herself more isolated than ever. That night Jacob made a nicer dinner than usual. Nothing fancy, just a beef stew with vegetables and fresh bread. He set the table inside the cabin with 2 plates instead of leaving hers on the porch. When Eleanor came to collect her meal and saw the setup, she hesitated. "Would you like to eat inside tonight?" Jacob asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Seems silly to eat separately when I've got a perfectly good table." Eleanor looked at the table, then at him, suspicion clear in her eyes. "Why?" "Because I'm tired of eating alone," Jacob said honestly. "I spent 3 years doing that before you got here. Seems stupid to keep doing it now." She stood there for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she nodded once and came inside, though she moved like someone walking into potential danger. They ate in silence for several minutes. The only sounds were silverware against plates and the occasional creak of Eleanor's chair as she tried to find a comfortable position. The cabin furniture wasn't built for someone her size, and she looked perpetually uncomfortable, hunched over to fit. "The roof looks good," Jacob finally said. "The barn, I mean. You did a solid job with it. It needed doing." Eleanor didn't look up from her plate. "Yeah, but I'd been putting it off forever, telling myself I'd get to it eventually." Jacob took a sip of water. "Truth is, I probably never would have. I'm not great with heights." That got Eleanor to glance up just for a second, maybe surprised by his admission of weakness. "And the fencing," Jacob continued, "and the pump, and everything else you've been fixing around here. You're making this place look better than it has in years. I'm earning my keep." Her voice was hard, defensive. "You don't have to earn anything. This is your home now, too." Eleanor's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Is it? Because it feels more like a place I'm not wanted but can't afford to leave." The honesty of it hit Jacob like a punch. Because she was right, wasn't she? They were both trapped, both stuck in a marriage neither wanted but couldn't escape without admitting total failure. "I'm sorry," Jacob said quietly. "I'm sorry I'm not what you expected. I'm sorry this whole thing has been such a disappointment." Eleanor set down her fork carefully. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than he'd heard it before. "I'm sorry, too. I know I'm not. I know you wanted someone different. Someone smaller, prettier, more like a real woman." "You are a real woman," Jacob said automatically, then felt stupid for how defensive it sounded. "You know what I mean." Eleanor's eyes were hard now, challenging. "Don't pretend you weren't disappointed when I stepped off that train. I saw your face. I've seen that look 1,000 times in my life." Jacob wanted to deny it, but couldn't. Because she was right. He had been disappointed. Shocked, really, and she'd seen all of it written on his face in that first moment. They finished the meal in heavy silence. When Eleanor stood to leave, Jacob almost let her go without saying anything else. But something made him speak up. "My whole life, people have looked at me and decided I'm not enough," he said to her back. "Too short, too small, not strong enough, not man enough. I moved out here partly to get away from that. To build something where maybe I could feel like I measured up to something." Eleanor paused at the door but didn't turn around. "I understand what it's like," Jacob continued. "To not fit, to have people decide who you are before they even talk to you, to see disappointment in their eyes when they look at you. I understand that more than you probably think." Eleanor stood there for a long moment, her hand on the doorframe. Then, without saying anything, she walked out into the night back toward the barn. But the next morning something was different. Eleanor still got up at dawn and started working before Jacob was awake. But when he brought coffee out to her, she took it with a quiet thank you instead of just a nod. And that evening she came inside for dinner without being asked. They were still awkward around each other. Still walking on eggshells, still not sure what to say or how to act. But something had shifted, even if just slightly. Some tiny crack in the wall they'd both built up. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't comfort. It certainly wasn't the marriage either of them had imagined. But it was something. A small acknowledgement that maybe they weren't complete enemies. That maybe, just maybe, they were both just two lonely people trying to survive a situation neither knew how to handle. The barn roof stayed fixed. The fences stood strong. And Eleanor continued to sleep out in the barn. But now she at least came inside for meals. It wasn't much, but in those early days it felt like progress. Neither of them could have known that everything was about to change. That soon, they'd be forced to see each other in a completely different light. That danger was coming, and when it arrived, all their careful distance and polite coldness would shatter completely. But for now, they just took it one awkward dinner at a time. Two misfits sharing space and trying not to make each other more miserable than necessary. 3 weeks had passed since Eleanor arrived, and they'd settled into an uncomfortable routine. They ate meals together now, which was progress, but the conversations were still stilted and careful. They were like two dancers who didn't know the steps, constantly afraid of stepping on each other's toes. Jacob had noticed wolves circling the property for the past several days. He'd seen their tracks in the mud near the chicken coop, heard their howls in the distance at night. The chickens were getting nervous, clustering together more than usual, making agitated sounds whenever dusk approached. He'd tried to reinforce the coop as best he could, but he knew it wasn't enough. The wolves were getting bolder, coming closer each night. He'd started keeping his rifle by the door, loaded and ready. Eleanor had noticed too. She'd mentioned the tracks one morning at breakfast, her voice matter of fact. "You've got wolves. Big ones from the looks of those prints." "Yeah," Jacob had agreed. "Been seeing them around. I'm keeping watch." What he didn't mention was how much the situation worried him. Wolves were smart, patient. They'd wait for the right moment, and when they struck, they'd be fast and brutal. He wasn't sure he'd be able to stop them, not if they came in a pack. The attack came on a Tuesday night. 3 days after that conversation, Jacob had been asleep for maybe an hour when the chickens started screaming. Not their normal alarmed clucking, but genuine screams of terror. He was out of bed instantly, grabbing his rifle and stumbling for the door. The moon was bright enough to see by, and what he saw made his blood run cold. At least 5 wolves, maybe more, were circling the chicken coop. 2 had already broken through the wire mesh Eleanor had reinforced, and the sounds coming from inside the coop were horrible. Jacob raised his rifle and fired at the nearest wolf. He missed. The recoil knocked him back a step, and in his panic he'd aimed poorly. He tried to steady himself for another shot, but the wolves had noticed him now. One of them, a huge gray beast with yellow eyes, turned away from the coop and started moving toward him. Jacob backed up, trying to reload, but his hands were shaking. The wolf was getting closer, moving with that confident predator stride that said it knew it had found easier prey than chickens. Jacob's boot caught on something, a rock or a root, and he went down hard on his back. The rifle fell from his hands, landing just out of reach. The wolf lunged, and then suddenly Eleanor was there. She'd come from the barn, wearing just her nightgown, her hair loose and wild around her shoulders. She didn't have a weapon, didn't have anything except her bare hands, but she grabbed a fence post that had been leaning against the barn, a solid piece of wood at least 6 feet long and heavy enough that Jacob had needed both hands to move it earlier that week. Eleanor swung it like it weighed nothing. The first wolf, the one that had been about to tear into Jacob, took the hit directly to its ribs. The sound of impact was sickening, and the wolf yelped and tumbled sideways. Before it could recover, Eleanor was already spinning toward the next threat. 2 wolves were coming at her from different directions, trying to flank her. She didn't hesitate. She planted the fence post like a staff and used it to vault herself sideways, avoiding one wolf's lunge entirely. Then she brought the post down like a hammer on the second wolf's back. Jacob scrambled to his feet, grabbed his rifle, and finally managed to get off a clean shot. One wolf dropped. Eleanor was already engaging another, using the fence post to keep it at bay, jabbing and striking with precision that would have been impressive if the situation wasn't so terrifying. The fight probably lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Between Jacob's rifle and Eleanor's raw physical power, they managed to drive the wolves off. 3 lay dead or dying in the yard. The others had retreated into the darkness, their howls fading into the distance. When the last wolf disappeared, Eleanor dropped the fence post and bent over, hands on her knees, breathing hard. Her nightgown was torn, and Jacob could see scratches on her arms where one of the wolves had gotten close enough to claw her. But she was alive. They were both alive. "Are you hurt?" she asked, straightening up and moving toward him before he could ask her the same question. "I'm fine. I fell." Jacob felt his face burn with embarrassment even in the middle of the crisis. "Are you okay?" "Your arms, just scratches." Eleanor looked down at them like she'd just noticed. "Nothing serious." They stood there in the moonlight, both breathing hard, the reality of what had just happened settling over them. Eleanor had saved his life. No question about it. If she hadn't been there, if she hadn't grabbed that fence post and fought off those wolves, he'd be dead right now. "I should check the chickens," Eleanor said, starting to turn away. "Wait." Jacob reached out and caught her arm, then immediately dropped it when she tensed. "Thank you. You saved my life." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. "You would have done the same for me." Would he have? Jacob wanted to say yes, but honestly, he didn't know if he could have. She'd fought off 3 wolves like it was nothing, like she was born to it. He'd barely managed to fire his rifle without shooting himself in the foot. "Come inside," Jacob said. "Let me clean those scratches. They could get infected." For once, Eleanor didn't argue. Maybe she was too tired. Maybe the adrenaline was wearing off and the pain was starting to register. Either way, she followed him into the cabin without protest. Jacob lit more lamps and pulled out the medical supplies he kept in a cabinet. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she looked vulnerable. Her hair was loose and tangled, her nightgown torn and dirty, blood running down her arms from the scratches. Jacob wet a clean cloth and started carefully cleaning the wounds. They were deeper than Eleanor had made them sound, but not bad enough to need stitches. As he worked, he became aware of how close they were, how this was the first time he'd really been this near to her, the first time he'd touched her beyond that awkward handshake when she'd first arrived. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked, trying to fill the silence. "The docks weren't safe for anyone, especially not for a woman," Eleanor said, her voice quiet. "I learned early that I had to be able to defend myself, that no one else was going to do it for me." Jacob applied some antiseptic to the scratches and Eleanor hissed slightly but didn't pull away. That must have been hard. Growing up like that. It was what it was. Eleanor watched him work, her expression carefully neutral. My father was ashamed of me. My mother died when I was young. I was too tall, too strong, too everything wrong. The other children made fun of me. Boys were scared of me or wanted to prove they could beat me up. Girls wanted nothing to do with me. Jacob wrapped a clean bandage around her arm. I got beat up a lot as a kid, he said quietly. The other boys liked to prove they were tougher than the short kid. Made them feel big, I guess. Did you fight back? Sometimes. Never won, but I tried. Jacob moved to her other arm, cleaning the scratches there. Eventually, I just tried to stay out of everyone's way. Figured if I was invisible, they'd leave me alone. Did it work? Not really. Being small meant being an easy target. Being invisible just meant no one noticed when things got bad. He finished bandaging her second arm and sat back. I thought coming out here would be different. Thought maybe on the frontier what mattered was hard work and determination, not how tall you stood. And was it different? Eleanor asked. Jacob laughed, but there was no humor in it. Not really. Ranchers still looked at me and saw someone who couldn't handle the work. Town still treated me like I was less than. I managed to get this homestead, but even then, people acted like it was a joke, like I was playing at being a real rancher. They sat in silence for a moment, the lamplight flickering between them. Outside, one of the dead wolves made a sound. Probably just nerves firing as it died, but it made them both jump slightly. I should move those carcasses away from the house, Eleanor said. Starting to stand tomorrow, Jacob said firmly. It's the middle of the night, you're injured, and there might be more wolves out there. The carcasses can wait until morning. Eleanor looked like she might argue, but then she nodded and sat back down. Another first. Her actually listening to him, accepting his judgment on something. You know, Jacob said slowly, I've been thinking about what you said the other night. About not being wanted here. Eleanor's expression closed off. You don't have to. Let me finish, Jacob interrupted. Please. She pressed her lips together but nodded for him to continue. You were right. When you stepped off that train, I was disappointed. Shocked, really. You weren't what I expected, what I'd asked for, what I'd imagined. Jacob met her eyes, making himself be honest. But tonight you saved my life. You didn't have to. You could have stayed in the barn, let the wolves do their damage, and caught the next train back east. No one would have blamed you. I'm not that kind of person, Eleanor said quietly. I know. That's my point, Jacob leaned forward. You're not what I expected, but maybe what I expected was wrong. Maybe I was asking for the wrong things. I wanted someone small and delicate because I thought that would make me feel bigger. But that's not what I needed. What I needed was a partner, someone strong enough to handle this life, someone who wouldn't break under the pressure. 2 weeks after the wolf attack, Jacob realized they were running low on supplies. The pantry was nearly empty. They needed new tools to replace ones that had broken. And Eleanor needed fabric for some new clothes since most of hers had been damaged during the constant hard work around the homestead. Going to town meant facing people. It meant dealing with stares and whispers and judgment. Jacob had been putting it off, but there was no avoiding it anymore. We need to go into town for supplies, he told Eleanor over breakfast one morning. He saw her shoulders tense immediately. She'd been smiling just a moment before, relaxed in a way she'd started to become around him. But the mention of town brought all her walls right back up. I can stay here, she said quickly. You can go alone. Just tell me what fabric you think would work and... Eleanor. Jacob set down his coffee cup. You're my wife. We're going to town together. Jacob, you know what it'll be like. People will stare. They'll talk. It'll be embarrassing for you. Let them stare. Jacob tried to sound more confident than he felt. Let them talk. Doesn't change anything. But the truth was he was dreading it too. The station master had seen Eleanor when she arrived, and in a small town like theirs, gossip spread faster than wildfire. By now, everyone within 20 miles probably knew about Jacob Morrison's giant bride. He could already imagine the jokes, the cruel laughter, the pitying looks. The wagon ride into town was quiet. Eleanor sat rigid beside him, her face set in that carefully blank expression she used when she was preparing for pain. Jacob's stomach churned with anxiety. He wanted to be strong for her, to protect her from what was coming, but he felt about as protective as a house cat. They reached town just before noon. Main Street was busy with the usual Saturday crowd. Families doing their shopping, ranchers trading stories outside the saloon, children running between buildings playing games. Normal small-town life. Until Jacob and Eleanor climbed down from their wagon. It was like someone had rung a bell. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. People turned to stare. A woman actually grabbed her child and pulled him closer, as if Eleanor was some kind of dangerous animal that might attack. Jacob heard the whispers start immediately. They weren't even trying to be quiet about it. Good Lord, would you look at the size of her? That's Morrison's mail-order bride? Poor man. She looks like she could snap him in half. What kind of woman is that big? It ain't natural. Eleanor heard them too. Jacob could tell by the way her jaw tightened, by the way her hands clenched into fists at her sides. But she kept her head up, kept walking beside him toward the general store. Children pointed openly. One boy, maybe 8 years old, laughed and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Pa, that lady's taller than Mr. Henderson's horse." His father didn't correct him, just chuckled and shook his head. Jacob felt his own face burning with humiliation. Not for himself, but for Eleanor. For the fact that she had to endure this. For the fact that he couldn't make it stop. They reached the general store and Jacob held the door open for Eleanor. She had to duck to get through, which made a couple of men standing nearby burst into laughter. Jacob shot them a glare, but they just grinned back at him, not even ashamed. Inside the store, things got worse. Mr. Peterson, the store owner, looked up from behind his counter and his eyes went wide. Morrison. And this must be your wife. The way he said wife made it sound like a question, like he wasn't quite sure the word applied. Yes, this is my wife, Eleanor, Jacob said firmly. We need some supplies, and Eleanor needs fabric for some new dresses. Mr. Peterson nodded slowly, but he kept staring at Eleanor like she was some kind of circus attraction. Of course. The fabric's over on that wall there, though I'm not sure we have anything that would accommodate someone of her size. Eleanor's face remained impassive, but Jacob saw the tiny flinch, the hit that landed. Other customers in the store were whispering to each other, not even pretending to shop anymore. Just standing there watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Mrs. Whitmore, the banker's wife and the biggest gossip in town, sidled up to Jacob while Eleanor was looking at fabric across the store. "Oh, Jacob," she said in a voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You poor dear. This must be so difficult for you." "I'm fine, Mrs. Whitmore," Jacob said stiffly. "But surely you didn't expect— I mean, when you sent for a bride, you must have imagined someone more appropriate?" She lowered her voice to a stage whisper. "Someone more feminine?" Jacob opened his mouth to respond, but Mrs. Whitmore just kept talking. "I'm sure she's very nice, but really, what will people think? A man of your stature with a woman like that? It's almost comical." She actually patted his arm. "Poor thing. You must feel so inadequate next to her." Something inside Jacob snapped. He'd dealt with this kind of condescension his entire life. People treating him like a child, like someone to be pitied, like he wasn't a real man because he was short. And he'd learned to swallow it, to smile and nod and let it roll off his back. But hearing someone talk about Eleanor that way, hearing the cruelty wrapped up in fake concern, he couldn't stomach it. "Mrs. Whitmore," Jacob said loudly enough that several people turned to look. "My wife is more of a woman than you'll ever be. She's strong, she's capable, and she's worth 10 of the people in this town who think it's funny to mock someone for being different." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth fell open in shock. Jacob wasn't done. He raised his voice even more, making sure everyone in the store could hear him. "Yes, my wife is tall. Yes, she's strong. And yes, she's the best thing that ever happened to me. Anyone who has a problem with that can say it to my face instead of whispering behind their hands like cowards." The store had gone completely silent. Everyone was staring at him now instead of Eleanor. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Now, Jacob, there's no need to—" "There's every need," Jacob cut him off. He turned to address the whole store. "My wife works harder than any of you. She's tougher than any man here. She saved my life 2 weeks ago when wolves attacked our property. While you all were safe in your beds, she was fighting off 5 wolves with her bare hands." Jacob walked over to where Eleanor stood frozen by the fabric display. He took her hand in his, noting how it completely dwarfed his own, and he didn't care. He held it firmly, proudly. "This is Eleanor Morrison," he announced to everyone. "My wife, my partner. and I'm the luckiest man in Wyoming that she agreed to marry me." Eleanor was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Shock, definitely, but also something else. Something that made her eyes glisten with unshed tears. "Now," Jacob continued, his voice calmer but still firm. "We came here to buy supplies and fabric, Mr. Peterson. Can you help us, or do we need to take our business elsewhere?" The store owner stammered. Of course. I'll help you right away." The other customers slowly went back to their shopping, though the whispers continued. But they were quieter now, less bold, and some of the looks directed at Eleanor had changed. Not all of them, but some, from mockery to something like uncertainty, maybe even a little respect. Jacob and Eleanor finished their shopping in relative peace. Mr. Peterson was overly helpful, probably afraid Jacob would complain to someone about his earlier rudeness. They loaded their supplies into the wagon, and Jacob helped Eleanor up onto the bench. As they were about to leave, a woman approached them. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with kind eyes and weathered hands. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "Mrs. Morrison?" Eleanor looked down at her warily. "Yes? I just wanted to say, my husband and I have a farm about 10 miles east of here. Last month we had a barn fire. Lost almost everything." The woman's voice was thick with emotion. "We've been trying to rebuild, but it's just the two of us, and we're not as young as we used to be. If you and your husband ever need work, or if you might be willing to help us for a day or two, we'd be grateful. We can pay not much, but something." Eleanor blinked in surprise. Yes, we could do that." The woman smiled, genuine and warm. "Thank you. I'm Mrs. Chen, come by any time." She glanced at Jacob and nodded respectfully. "You've got a good woman there, Mr. Morrison. Don't let these small-minded fools tell you different." As they rode out of town, Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Jacob kept glancing at her, trying to gauge what she was thinking. Her face was unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did. They're going to make your life harder now. The whole town saw you defend me, saw you stand up for me. They'll mock you even more. Let them." Jacob meant it. "I'm tired of caring what small-minded people think. I'm tired of trying to make myself acceptable to people who were never going to accept me anyway." Eleanor was quiet for another moment. Then so softly he almost didn't hear it, she said, "No one's ever done that before. Defended me like that. Stood up for me." "Well, they should have," Jacob said firmly. "You deserve to be defended. You deserve to be treated with respect." "So do you," Eleanor said. And when Jacob looked at her, she was smiling, really smiling. Not the small, careful ones he'd seen before, but a full, genuine smile that made her whole face light up. "Thank you, Jacob, for what you did back there. For what you said. I meant every word." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the tension from town slowly draining away. October in Wyoming was usually mild, with crisp mornings and sunny afternoons. But that year, something was different. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity. The animals were acting strange, restless, and nervous. Jacob had lived on the prairie long enough to know what it meant. Bad weather was coming. He just didn't know how bad until the morning he woke to find the sky had turned an ominous gray-green color. The wind had picked up overnight, strong enough to rattle the windows, and the temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees. Eleanor was already up, standing at the kitchen window and staring at the horizon. "That doesn't look good," she said when Jacob joined her. "No," he agreed. "Looks like a blizzard. A big one." They spent the morning preparing. Jacob brought all the animals into the barn and the sheltered areas close to the cabin. Eleanor reinforced the doors and windows, making sure everything was sealed tight against the coming storm. They hauled extra firewood inside, stacking it by the hearth. They filled every container they had with water from the well. By noon, the first snowflakes started falling. By 2 o'clock, you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of your face. The blizzard hit with a fury that shocked both of them. Snow fell so thick and fast it was like someone had hung a white curtain over the world. The wind howled like a living thing, shaking the cabin walls, finding every tiny crack and crevice to whistle through. Within an hour, snow had drifted up to the windows. Jacob tried to look outside, but all he could see was white. Complete, total white. The barn was only 50 feet from the cabin, but it had completely disappeared in the storm. If someone went out there, they'd be lost in seconds. "I've never seen anything like this," Eleanor said, her voice hushed with something like awe. She stood at the window, watching the storm rage. "Not even in Boston during the worst winters." Prairie storms can be brutal, Jacob said. This is a bad one, though. Might be here for days, he was right. The storm didn't let up. Not that day, not that night, not the next day. By the second morning, they were completely snowed in. The doors wouldn't open because of the drifts piled against them. The windows were covered halfway up. The world had shrunk to just the inside of the cabin. At first, they tried to keep busy. Eleanor mended clothes that had been sitting in a pile for weeks. Jacob worked on repairing some leather tack that had needed attention. They kept the fire going, rationed their food carefully, and tried not to think about how long the storm might last. But by the second day, there was only so much busy work they could do. Eventually, they ended up sitting by the fire, the howling wind their only company besides each other. Tell me about Boston, Jacob said, breaking a long silence. What was it like growing up there? Eleanor was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Crowded, dirty, loud, she smiled slightly. But exciting too in its way. Always something happening, always people everywhere. The exact opposite of here. Do you miss it? Sometimes. Not the work, not the way people treated me. But I miss having a library close by. Miss the smell of the ocean. She glanced at him. What about you? Where did you grow up? Pennsylvania. Small farming town. My father had land, but not much of it. 5 brothers, all of them taller than me by the time they were 12. Jacob poked at the fire with a stick. I was always the runt, the one who couldn't keep up. Is that why you left? Part of it. My father made it clear there wasn't room for me in his plans. Told me I should find a trade in town, something that didn't require real strength. Jacob's voice was bitter. When I was 18, I took what little money I had and headed west. Figured if I was going to be a disappointment, I might as well do it somewhere new. They talked through the afternoon, swapping stories about their childhoods, their families, their dreams. Eleanor told him about sneaking into a theater once to see a play, hiding in the back where no one would notice her. About the one teacher who'd been kind to her, who'd encouraged her to read even when others said it was pointless for a girl like her. Jacob told her about the time he tried to join the army and was rejected for being too short. About working at a dozen different ranches, always being given the worst jobs, always being paid less because owners figured he couldn't do real work anyway. As the second night fell and the storm continued to rage, they moved on to deeper topics. Eleanor talked about how it felt to be alone in a crowd, to be surrounded by people who all saw you as something other, something wrong. Jacob shared his own experiences of isolation, of feeling like no matter how hard he worked or how much he proved himself, he'd never be enough. I used to pray I'd wake up different, Eleanor admitted quietly, that somehow overnight I'd shrink down to a normal size, that I'd be pretty and delicate and everything a woman was supposed to be. Did you ever? Jacob asked. Wake up different? No, every morning I was still the same. Still too tall, still too strong, still all wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Eventually, I stopped praying for it. Figured God wasn't listening or he'd made me this way on purpose and changing it wasn't part of the plan. I used to wish I'd grow, Jacob said. Drank milk until I was sick. Hung from tree branches thinking it might stretch me out. Nothing worked. This is just who I am. Who we are, Eleanor corrected softly. The third day of the storm was the hardest. They were running low on firewood, and the cold was seeping into the cabin despite their best efforts. They'd eaten through most of the fresh food and were down to dried goods. But more than the physical discomfort, the isolation was getting to them. Being trapped in a small cabin with someone, even someone you were starting to care about, was intense. There was no escape, no privacy, no break from each other's presence. Every little habit became magnified. Every silence felt loaded with meaning. That afternoon they had their first real argument. It started over something stupid. Jacob had been rationing the coffee too carefully, trying to make it last, and Eleanor snapped at him that if they were going to be miserable, they might as well at least have decent coffee. Jacob fired back that maybe if she wasn't so wasteful with the firewood, they wouldn't need to worry about running out of supplies. Eleanor said she was wasteful? He was the one who kept the fire too hot because he couldn't handle a little cold. It escalated from there. All the little frustrations and tensions that had been building up came pouring out. Eleanor said Jacob was too controlling, always having to manage everything. Jacob said Eleanor never asked for help, just bulldozed through everything like she was the only one who could do anything right. They said things they didn't mean. Brought up old resentments. Jacob mentioned how Eleanor had wanted to sleep in the barn, how she'd made it clear she didn't want anything to do with him. Eleanor brought up the disappointment on his face when she'd first stepped off the train, how he'd clearly wished she'd just leave. It was ugly. Painful. All the wounds they'd been carefully avoiding tearing open at once. Eleanor stood up, her face flushed with anger. You know what? Maybe this whole thing was a mistake. Maybe I should have just stayed in Boston where at least people were honest about hating me, instead of pretending everything was fine while being disappointed every single day. Maybe you should have. Jacob shot back, standing up too, even though it put him at an even more ridiculous height disadvantage. Maybe we both should have saved ourselves the trouble and admitted this was never going to work. They stood there glaring at each other, breathing hard. The fire crackled between them. The wind howled outside, and slowly the anger started to drain away, replaced by something else. Regret? Sadness? Understanding that they'd both just said things they couldn't take back. Eleanor sank back down into her chair, suddenly looking exhausted. I didn't mean that. Neither did I, Jacob said quietly. Sitting down as well, silence stretched between them. But it was different now, heavier, more honest. I was disappointed, Jacob finally said, when you got off that train. I was shocked and disappointed and scared. You're right about that. But Eleanor, that disappointment lasted about 2 days. By the time you fought off those wolves, I was already seeing you differently. And now? He trailed off. Now? Eleanor prompted, her voice barely above a whisper. Now I can't imagine anyone else here. Can't imagine anyone else I'd rather be trapped in a cabin with during a blizzard. Can't imagine my life without you in it. Jacob met her eyes. You're not a disappointment, Eleanor. You never were. I was just too stupid and scared to see what was right in front of me. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. I wanted to leave so many times. Wanted to get back on that train and never look back. But I couldn't. Not because I didn't have money or didn't have anywhere to go, but because every day I stayed, I found another reason to want to be here. Found another thing about you that made me think maybe this could work. Like what? Jacob asked. Like how you read poetry. Like how you defended me in town even though it cost you. Like how you're kind to the animals and patient with me even when I'm being difficult. Like how you're stronger than you look, not physically but in the ways that actually matter. She wiped at her eyes. Like how you make me feel like maybe I'm not wrong. Maybe I'm just different. And maybe different can be okay. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin something had shifted again. Another wall had come down. Another layer of pretense had been. Spring arrived like a promise. The snow melted, revealing the prairie grass underneath, green and fresh and new. The air warmed. Birds returned, filling the mornings with sound. And Jacob and Eleanor emerged from the long winter as something different than what they'd been before. They were partners now. Real partners. Not just two people living in the same space, but a team working toward the same goals. But spring also brought challenges that would test everything they'd built. The first disaster came in early April. 3 days of heavy rain caused the creek that ran through their property to overflow its banks. By the time Jacob noticed what was happening, half their planted fields were underwater, weeks of work destroyed in hours. Seeds washed away, soil eroded, irrigation ditches collapsed. Jacob stood at the edge of the flooded field, watching years of planning disappear under muddy water, and felt despair settle over him like a heavy coat. This was too much. They'd put everything into those crops and now it was just gone. We'll replant, Eleanor said beside him, her voice steady. There's not enough time. The season's already started. We'll lose the whole year's harvest. Then we'll find another way. Eleanor grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to look at her. We've survived worse. We'll survive this, she was right. They did survive. Eleanor threw herself into salvaging what could be saved, working 18-hour days to redirect water, shore up ditches, and replant what they could. Jacob handled the planning, figuring out which crops would still grow with a late start, negotiating with suppliers for seeds they could actually afford. They didn't save the whole harvest, but they saved enough to get by, enough to keep going. Then came the second disaster, worse than the first. Jacob was on a ladder, repairing the roof of the chicken coop, when the ladder slipped on wet ground. He fell hard, landing on his leg at a bad angle. The snap was audible. So was his scream. Eleanor came running from the barn. One look at his leg told her everything. The bone was broken badly. His lower leg bent at an angle that legs weren't supposed to bend. "Don't move," she ordered, her face pale but her voice calm. "I need to set this before I can move you." What followed was the most painful experience of Jacob's life. Eleanor had to straighten the leg, set the bone, and splint it, all while Jacob bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. By the time she was done, he was soaked with sweat and shaking with shock. She carried him into the cabin, actually picked him up like he weighed nothing and carried him to his bed. The humiliation of it barely registered through the pain. The doctor came out from town the next day. He examined Jacob's leg, looked at Eleanor's splinting job, and nodded with grudging approval. "You did good work here. Bones set properly. He'll need to stay off it for at least 6 weeks, maybe 8. 6 weeks. 6 weeks where Jacob couldn't work, couldn't help, couldn't do anything but lie in bed and feel useless. Eleanor took over everything. She managed the animals. All of them, from the horses to the chickens to the milk cow. She finished the planting, doing in days what should have taken weeks. She repaired equipment, mended fences, hauled water, chopped wood. She did the work of 2 people without complaint, without slowing down, without breaking. But it wasn't just the physical work. Eleanor also handled the business side of things. When their neighbor Mr. Chen came by to discuss buying some of their cattle, Eleanor negotiated the deal. Jacob listened from his bed, expecting her to get taken advantage of, expecting Chen to lowball her because she was a woman. Instead, Eleanor got a better price than Jacob had ever managed. She knew the market value, knew their cattle were high quality, and refused to settle for less than they were worth. Chen left, shaking his head but smiling, muttering about how Morrison had gotten himself a sharp one. Word spread fast. The giant woman who'd been a joke just months ago was now running the Morrison homestead better than Jacob ever had. People started coming to her for help, not out of pity, but because she was genuinely the best person for the job. Mrs. Chen came by one morning with news. "My sister's expecting a baby," she said. "But it's complicated. The doctor's worried. He's staying at their place, but he needs help. Someone strong who won't panic. I thought of you." Eleanor looked at Jacob, uncertainty in her eyes. "I've never delivered a baby before." "You've delivered calves," Jacob said from his bed. "Can't be that different. Go, they need you." Eleanor went. She was gone for almost 2 full days. When she came back, exhausted and covered in who knows what, she was smiling. "It's a girl. Healthy, mother's doing fine. The doctor said I did good." That story spread too. The woman who could fight wolves, negotiate cattle deals, and deliver babies. Eleanor was becoming a legend in the county, and she didn't even realize it. Meanwhile, Jacob lay in bed, feeling increasingly useless. His leg was healing, but slowly. He couldn't walk, couldn't work, couldn't contribute. All he could do was lie there and watch Eleanor do everything. It was torture. Not physical torture, though his leg hurt plenty, but emotional torture, watching her prove she didn't need him. Watching her thrive in ways she never could have if he'd been healthy enough to get in her way. "I'm worthless," he said one night, the words bitter in his mouth. Eleanor looked up from the account books she'd been studying. She'd taken over the finances too, and was doing a better job than he had. "What? I'm worthless." "You don't need me. You're better off without me getting in the way." Eleanor set down the books and came to sit on the edge of his bed. "Jacob Morrison, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard." "Is it? Look at you. Look at everything you're doing. You don't need me for any of it. You're right. I don't need you to lift heavy things or plow fields or any of that." Eleanor took his hand. "But I need you for everything else. Who do you think has been teaching me which crops to plant where? Who explained the irrigation system? Who knows every supplier and customer and neighbor and their whole history? That's just knowledge. Anyone could. Who holds me when I wake up from nightmares?" Eleanor interrupted. "Who makes me laugh when I'm exhausted? Who believed I could do all this in the first place? Who looked at me and saw a partner instead of a freak?" Jacob was quiet. "I'm stronger than you," Eleanor continued. "Physically stronger, I mean. That's just a fact. But you're better at planning, at thinking through problems, at understanding people. You're better with numbers, with words, with making things make sense. We're different kinds of strong, Jacob. And together we're stronger than either of us could ever be alone." She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "So stop feeling sorry for yourself and help me figure out these account books. Because you're right that I'm doing good work, but I'm also about to accidentally put us in debt if I can't make sense of this column here." Jacob laughed despite himself, and he did help her with the books, and with planning the next season's crops, and with writing letters to suppliers, and with 100 other things that he could do from his bed that needed doing. By the time his leg healed enough for him to walk with a crutch, the homestead was in better shape than it had ever been. The fields were thriving despite the late start. The animals were healthy. They'd even made a small profit for the first time in years. And more than that, people had started to change how they saw them. When Jacob and Eleanor went to town, people didn't stare quite so openly anymore. Some folks even nodded respectfully. Children still pointed at Eleanor's height. But their parents shushed them now instead of laughing along. Old man Henderson, who owned the largest ranch in the county, actually came out to their homestead to ask Eleanor's advice on a structural problem with one of his barns. He paid her for her time, treated her like the professional she was. The banker's wife, Mrs. Whitmore, was one of the last holdouts. She still sniffed disapprovingly whenever she saw them, still made snide comments under her breath, but even she couldn't deny the results. The Morrison homestead was thriving, and everyone knew it was largely thanks to Eleanor. One evening, as summer was approaching, Jacob and Eleanor sat on their porch watching the sunset. Jacob's leg was almost fully healed now. He could walk without the crutch, though he still limped when he was tired. "Remember when I first got here?" Eleanor asked quietly. "When I slept in the barn and couldn't stand to be near you." "I remember you couldn't get away from me fast enough," Jacob said. "Seems like a lifetime ago." "It was a lifetime ago. We're different people now." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, something she'd started doing after the blizzard and never stopped. It should have been awkward, given their height difference, but they'd figured out how to make it work, just like they'd figured out everything else. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Sending for a mail-order bride? Getting stuck with me instead of whoever you were imagining?" Jacob thought about it seriously, about the disappointment he'd felt that first day, about all the difficulties and challenges and awkward moments, about everything they'd been through. "Not for a single second," he said honestly. "Best decision I ever made, even if I didn't know it at the time. Even though I'm not what you asked for. Especially because you're not what I asked for. What I asked for was someone to make me feel bigger. What I got was someone who made me actually be bigger, better, stronger." Jacob took her hand. "You didn't make me feel like more of a man, Eleanor." 2 years. 2 years since Eleanor had stepped off that train and into Jacob's life, turning everything he thought he knew upside down. Now Jacob stood on that same train platform, but everything was different. He wasn't alone this time. Eleanor stood beside him, one hand resting comfortably on his shoulder, the other holding the hand of their daughter, little Beth, who was bouncing excitedly on her toes. "Grandma's train is late," Beth announced, peering down the tracks with the impatience only a 3-year-old could muster. "It'll be here soon, sweetheart," Eleanor said, her voice carrying that gentle patience she used with their daughter, so different from the hard, defensive tone she'd had when she first arrived. Jacob looked up at his wife and marveled, not for the first time, at how much had changed. Eleanor no longer hunched her shoulders trying to make herself smaller. She stood tall, proud, comfortable in her own skin in a way she never had been before. Her face, once tight with constant vigilance against mockery, was relaxed and open. She smiled easily now, laughed often. The train whistle sounded in the distance, and Beth squealed with excitement. "It's coming! It's coming!" Jacob had been nervous about Eleanor's mother visiting. Eleanor had warned him that her mother had never accepted her, had always treated her like a disappointment. But Eleanor had written to her anyway, telling her about Beth, inviting her to come see her granddaughter. The train pulled into the station with its usual hiss and groan of steam. Passengers began disembarking, and Jacob watched Eleanor's face carefully, trying to gauge her emotions. She was nervous, he could tell. Her hand tightened slightly on his shoulder. Then an older woman appeared, small and frail-looking, with gray hair and Eleanor's same angular features. She stood on the platform looking around uncertainly until her eyes landed on Eleanor. Her mouth opened slightly in shock. "Mama!" Eleanor called out, her voice steady despite her nerves. Beth broke free from her mother's hand and ran forward. "Grandma, Grandma, I'm Beth." The older woman's face transformed as she looked down at the little girl. Beth had inherited her mother's height and was already taller than most children her age, but she moved through the world with an easy confidence that Eleanor had never known as a child. She grabbed her grandmother's hand without any shyness or hesitation. "Come meet Papa and Mama." Beth tugged her grandmother forward. Eleanor's mother let herself be led, her eyes never leaving Eleanor's face. When they stood face to face, there was a long moment of silence. "Ella," her mother finally said, using Eleanor's childhood name, "you look different." "I am different, Mama." Eleanor's voice was calm, but Jacob could hear the emotion underneath. "This is my husband Jacob, and this is our home now." Jacob extended his hand. "Mrs. Wright, welcome to Wyoming." Eleanor's mother shook his hand, but she was still staring at Eleanor. "You look happy," she said, and it sounded almost like an accusation. "I've never seen you look happy before." "I am happy," Eleanor said simply. "For the first time in my life, I'm happy." The visit started awkwardly, as Jacob had expected. Eleanor's mother clearly didn't know what to make of the life her daughter had built. She kept looking around the homestead like she was trying to find something to criticize, but couldn't quite figure out what. But Beth was the bridge between them. The little girl adored her grandmother instantly and insisted on showing her everything. The chickens, the horses, the garden, the barn where Mama had first slept when she arrived. She chattered constantly, telling stories about the wolves Mama had fought, about how Papa taught her to read, about how she was going to be tall like Mama, and that was wonderful. On the second day of the visit, Eleanor's mother helped prepare dinner while Eleanor was outside working. Jacob was at the table going over some paperwork when Mrs. Wright spoke. "She really is happy here," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "Yes, ma'am." "She is. I never thought—" She trailed off, staring out the window where Eleanor was visible, carrying a fence post that would have taken 2 men to lift. "I never thought anyone would want her." "Would see past all of her." Jacob set down his pen carefully. "With respect, Mrs. Wright, there's nothing to see past. Eleanor is exactly who she should be. You don't understand. Growing up, she was always too much. Too tall, too strong, too loud, too everything. Her father was ashamed of her. I tried to help her, tried to teach her to be more ladylike, more acceptable, but nothing worked. She just kept being herself." "Good," Jacob said firmly. "The world needs more people who are brave enough to just be themselves." Eleanor's mother turned to look at him, really look at him. "You're a very small man," she said bluntly. "Yes, ma'am, I am." "And you're not bothered by having a wife who's so much larger than you?" "At first I was," Jacob admitted. "I wanted someone who'd make me feel bigger. But Eleanor did something better. She made me realize that my size doesn't matter, that I'm not defined by how tall I stand but by what I stand for." He gestured out the window toward Eleanor. "Your daughter is the strongest person I've ever met. And I don't just mean physically, though, she's that too. She's strong in her character, in her spirit, in her willingness to keep going even when things are hard. She saved my life, Mrs. Wright. Not just from the wolves, though she did that too. She saved me from a life of feeling inadequate and small and never quite enough." Eleanor's mother was quiet for a long moment. Then softly she said, "I was wrong about her. All those years I was wrong." That evening, after Beth had been put to bed, Eleanor and her mother sat on the porch together. Jacob stayed inside, giving them privacy, but he could hear their voices through the open window. "I'm sorry, Ella," her mother said. "I'm sorry for making you feel like you needed to be different, like who you were wasn't good enough." "It's okay, Mama." "It's not okay. I let my own fears and the opinions of small-minded people make me ashamed of my own daughter." "That's not okay." There was a pause. "But you found someone who wasn't ashamed. Someone who sees you for who you really are." "Jacob sees me," Eleanor agreed, "and he's not afraid of what he sees. He's a good man. Small but good." Eleanor laughed. "He's the biggest man I know, Mama. Size has nothing to do with it." The next morning, the town organized a small gathering to welcome Mrs. Wright. It wasn't anything fancy, just neighbors stopping by with food and greetings, but it gave Eleanor's mother a chance to see how the community had come to view her daughter. People asked Eleanor's advice on everything from construction projects to animal husbandry to business decisions. They treated her with respect, with genuine admiration. Children ran up to her without fear, asking her to lift them up high or show them how strong she was. And Eleanor, Jacob's Eleanor, laughed and obliged, comfortable and confident in a way her mother had never seen. Mrs. Chen pulled Eleanor's mother aside at one point. "Your daughter saved my granddaughter's life," she said simply. When the baby was stuck, when the doctor didn't know what to do, Eleanor knew. She was calm. She was strong. She knew exactly what needed to be done. "My daughter and granddaughter are alive because of her." Another neighbor, old Mr. Henderson, added his own story. "Morrison's got the best-run homestead in the county now. Everyone knows it. And everyone knows it's because of his wife. She's got a mind for it, that one. Smart as a whip and works harder than any 3 men. By the end of the day, Eleanor's mother was crying. Not sad tears, but something else. Relief, maybe, or regret. Or just the overwhelming realization that her daughter had found something she'd never thought possible. The night before she was set to leave, Mrs. Wright asked to speak to Jacob privately. They walked out toward the barn in the evening light. "I want to tell you something," she said. "When Ella was born and just kept growing, I prayed every night that God would fix her, would make her normal, make her acceptable." Jacob didn't say anything, just listened. But standing here now, seeing the life she's built, seeing how happy she is, seeing that beautiful granddaughter who moves through the world like she owns it, I realized God didn't need to fix anything. She was never broken. I was the one who was broken for thinking she needed to be fixed. "She's the best thing that ever happened to me," Jacob said simply. "I asked for someone modest and small, and instead I got someone extraordinary and powerful. I thought I knew what I needed, but I didn't have a clue. Eleanor is exactly what I needed, even when I was too foolish to know it." Mrs. Wright smiled through her tears. "Take care of her." "Every day of my life," Jacob promised. When the train pulled away the next morning, carrying Eleanor's mother back to Boston, Eleanor stood waving with Beth in her arms. Jacob stood beside them, his hand in Eleanor's, and watched the train disappear into the distance. "She's different," Eleanor said quietly. "Mama, I mean." "Something changed. She saw what I see," Jacob replied. "She saw you." Eleanor looked down at him, and there were tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. "I never thought I'd have this. A home, a family. People who looked at me and didn't see something wrong." "There's nothing wrong with you," Jacob said, as he'd said 100 times before. "There never was." Beth wriggled in her mother's arms, wanting to be put down. Eleanor set her on the ground, and immediately the little girl ran off to chase a butterfly, her laughter ringing across the prairie. "She's going to be tall," Eleanor said, watching their daughter. "Taller than me."